2. Now we're recording. Okay, good. Just for those who are going to watch this recording, I forgot to start recording, so I'm going to start over a little bit here. I apologize for those of you who have to listen to me say this twice. Let's go back out here. We're starting chapter 3 today. The complete reports for your bridge project are due today, so get them in. And we're going to start chapter 3 on ethics. And to start this discussion on ethics, we've gone to the National Society for Professional Engineers, which is a society that maintains an ethics code for engineers. And I mentioned to everybody who was listening before that you can get a free student membership to the National Society of Professional Engineers just by going to nspe.org and going to their membership page and signing up as a student member. And it's completely free. You're going to get engineering magazines and publications and information in your email box and lots of cool stuff for engineers. So go do that. There's lots of engineering societies out there. Most of them have a free student membership. Now, moving on. Sorry for that delay. Goodness, what's the sounds? I have no idea what that sound was. Oh well. Okay, so moving on. Going into the Code of Ethics. So this is the National Society of Professional Engineers Code of Ethics. We're going to read through their 6 basic canons of their ethics to see what they're kind of all about here. So let me zoom in on that. All right, the fundamental canons. The first thing is to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. The reason that this is the first canon is because this one should override anything else. So this idea is most important, should be most important to engineers. Number 2, perform services only in areas of their competence. So engineers shall perform services only in the area of their competence. Number 3, you should issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. Number 4, engineers should act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. And 3 and 4 actually give us a little bit more explanation why these are put in a particular order. If issuing a public statement is actually dangerous to the safety, health, and welfare of the public, then you probably don't want to do it because the safety, health, and welfare of the public are more important. If acting for an employer as a faithful agent, if doing what your employer says is dangerous, right? It's dangerous to the safety, health, and welfare of the public, then you shouldn't do it. If performing a service outside of your area of competence is going to keep the safety and health and welfare of the public in a good way, then you need to do it, right? So all the ones that are after this first one can be broken in order to hold the first one, in order to keep the first law or the first canon of this code, right? If your employer asks you to design something that's electronic and you have no experience or expertise in electronics, then you shouldn't perform those services because it's not in your area of competence. Number 2 comes before number 4, right? So these are in an order for a reason. The first ones are most important. The last ones are still important but less important. Number 5 says to avoid deceptive acts. Number 6 says that engineers should conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. Now, the rest of the Code of Ethics is essentially just backup or details of these first 6 canons. Canons 1 through 5 are addressed in the rules of practice. So here's 1, engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare. Here's 2, and then they have a bunch of details here. For example, detail D is engineers should not permit the use of their name or associate in business ventures with any person or firm that they believe is engaged in fraudulent or dishonest enterprise. Because people who are fraudulent and dishonest generally don't care about safety, right? Number 2, engineers shall perform services only in their area of competence. A says engineers shall undertake assignments only when qualified by education or experience in the specific technical fields involved. And there are other details. So these are detailed explanations of the canons. They have a detailed explanation of 3, a detailed explanation of 4, a detailed explanation of 5. But the 6th canon is given its own section. So conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, lawfully. That's given its own section, the professional obligations. They talk about honesty and integrity. They talk about not promoting your own interest above, above the interests of your company, above the interest of other engineers. You shouldn't take advantage of other engineers to make yourself look better. Engineers shall at all times strive to serve the public interest. Engineers shall avoid all conduct or practice that deceives the public. Engineers shall not disclose without consent confidential information of businesses. Engineers shall not be influenced by their professional duties by conflicting interests. I mean, there's a lot of things here. There's 9 different sections under that last canon. And then they close it off with some closing statements. But all these ethics come down to, really, is that if you cannot behave, if you cannot be honest, if you cannot, honesty is really what it comes down to. Safety first and honesty. If you are going to deceive anybody in any way, or if you're going to put anybody in any kind of danger because you cannot behave properly, you should not be an engineer. And engineers that behave that way should be slapped down or removed from the engineering profession altogether. It happens a lot, unfortunately. It is not uncommon for people to break these canons or break these rules of ethics. It happens constantly. And we're going to spend some time today looking at some of the more extreme examples of these rules being broken. Now, like I said, this is not the only society that keeps track of engineering. It's not the only engineering society out there. Let's take a look at some others really quick. So this is National Society of Professional Engineers, but we can also go down to, let's see. This is the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. That they have a section on ethics as well, and they're all going to be slightly different, but they're all going to also cover essentially the same topics. So the American Society of Mechanical Engineers has their own section on ethics here, the Code of Ethics of Engineers, right here. Let's take a look at how it's different. They have fundamental principles, but they have 3 fundamental principles, and they have 6 fundamental canons, but the canons are different. The first one is about safety, health, welfare of the public. The second one is areas of competence, professional development through their careers. Right here in number 3 it says you shall continue to learn. That's not in the Code of Ethics for the Society of Professional Engineers. This last one, the engineers shall associate only with reputable persons of organizations. That's in a different place than it was in the other Code of Ethics. Actually, this one has more than 6 canons. This one has 10 canons. So they actually don't have nearly as many details as the other Code of Ethics, but it's basically the same kind of stuff, right? There's not much difference there. There's here several universities also have codes of ethics that they teach to their students that they make up themselves or that they get from other organizations. Here's the American Society of Civil Engineers. They have their own code of ethics as well. They have 4 fundamental principles and then 7 fundamental canons, and then they have a bunch of details for each canon under here. Very similar to the first one we saw. But they're all essentially the same in the end. There's the National Academy of Engineering They have a page on engineering ethics. Lots of people do, like I said before. It's always good to know what the code of ethics is for your particular field in engineering, but also to know kind of what other engineering fields are doing with that as well. So it's quite important. Now, breaches of these codes of conduct. When have these codes of conduct been broken? Can anybody think of a situation in the world where we think that maybe engineers may have been at fault? Anybody think of one?
Things like design failures, or
It doesn't necessarily need to be design failures, but that's one possibility. I can think of several recent situations. Anybody have an idea before I use my ideas? How about Hurricane Katrina? In Hurricane Katrina, what happened? New Orleans was flooded, right? Badly. Does anybody know why?
the levees weren't up to these.
Right, the levees and the dikes were not sufficient. Why not?
Because they were only rated for like a Class 2 hurricane.
Okay, so they were rated for a lower class hurricane, but that doesn't explain why they weren't sufficient. That explains that they were never upgraded, because those original dikes were built like back in the 30s. So why haven't they upgraded? Anybody know? Let's take a look at the history. Let's look at this. Hurricane Katrina. Let's take a look here. Okay, so I'm hearing a lot of feedback from you guys. Can you guys turn off your mic there so I'm not hearing that? Thanks. So Hurricane Katrina, the impact, New Orleans. Let's see if we can find something here. Analysis of New Orleans levee failures. Let's take a look here. So, American Society of Civil Engineers. Hey, you know, that's something we just looked up. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, whose federal mandate is responsible for the conception, design, and construction of the region's flood control system, failed to pay sufficient attention to public safety. That's what they said, right? According to the modeling, they say all this stuff. After independent investigators, so going down here to on April 5th, testified before the United States Senate Subcommittee, we have now concluded we had problems with the design of the structure. He testified that the U.S. Army Corps did not know of this mechanism of failure. The claim of ignorance is refuted by the National Science Foundation investigators hired by the Corps of Engineers. So they're arguing over this here. They've been reconstructed since then. They're talking about funding battles and everything else. Now, let's talk about what really happened. It's really kind of interesting what happened. There was money given to the people, to New Orleans, essentially, to the city of New Orleans and to the state of Louisiana to build these levees, and they were given the go-ahead to do it. But what happened with that money? Well, the governor of Louisiana, or not the governor, the governor of Louisiana and the mayor of New Orleans decided to use that money for other things. They used it for their own little pet projects. And did the engineers complain? No, not loud enough, obviously. Everybody ignored it because everybody got a little cut of the money. Now, money is probably the number one reason that engineering mistakes are made. People don't want to spend the money to fix things, they don't want to upgrade things to spend the money, or they want to use the money for something else to pay off their buddy that owns a company some other place and wants to do something else with the money. So they'll take their, friend the mayor out to Hawaii for a vacation. If you don't think this happens, it happens at every level of government in the world. It happens right here in North Platte, happens in Stapleton, it happens everywhere. Engineers are constantly ignored or shut up Or sometimes they're even involved in the problems. Sometimes they're involved in being unethical. Money is the number one reason for being unethical in engineering. Okay? And you can read all about the arguments that have gone on, and the people who've been fired, and the people who have pointed fingers at each other in New Orleans because these dikes didn't get upgraded. Well, the real problem wasn't even in the engineers, except that they should have stood up and said, we were supposed to have this money to build these things, we don't have it. And so, a big hurricane that comes in will drown the city. And they did say it. They just didn't continue to say it, because if they continued to say it, they're afraid they're going to lose their jobs. Well, what is the first thing in the canons? To hold paramount the safety of the public. That means you hold it above your own job. If it means you lose your job because you're going to save hundreds or thousands or even millions of lives, then you lose your job. But you should stand up and do it. It's a tough thing to face, and not all engineers face it. Most engineers do not build levees. Most engineers aren't building nuclear power plants. They're not building the things that are going to kill people if things go wrong. But some engineers do end up in those positions. Anybody think of another situation recently? Or not recently? How about a space shuttle? Was the Space Shuttle? Yeah, Space Shuttle Columbia, right? What happened to Space Shuttle Columbia?
One of the heat tiles was broken, and as it re-entered, it heated up the inside.
So they have ceramic tiles all around the Space Shuttle. Actually, mostly on the bottom of the Space Shuttle is where they're at. And these ceramic tiles are incredible. Let me show you what these tiles are capable of doing. Let's see if we can... Let's go to YouTube here and see a cool video. How come I can't spell? Tile. So the materials that they make the space shuttle tiles out of can be heated up to extreme temperatures. Let's take a look at this video and see what it shows us.
It's completely hate magnets.
If home remedy is an acne.
Reporting on it, but what we do have is we have the raw 9-pound material that we use. Now these have been in there at 2,200 degrees for hours. So you'll see they're blazing hot. Now most things if you put in an oven, like if you put a frozen pizza in, it would disintegrate after a couple minutes. So these things have been in there hours. If you put in metal, it may, if the metal did not melt, at least it would conduct the heat and keep the heat for so long that you couldn't get near it, well, within hours. Well, look at that. I mean, you can take this off.
So at 9,000 degrees for hours, and he just picked it up with his hand. That's the material that they use on space shuttles. Now, can you imagine why? Well, because it won't transfer the heat from that material into the space shuttle. That's the whole idea, because as they're coming in from space, they definitely don't want the heat from all the friction as they enter the atmosphere inside the space shuttle, because it will essentially just melt the space shuttle and it'll just fall apart, and it just turns into molten aluminum and steel and gunk like that, and of course human beings can't handle that. So that's the material that they use, and this is what we saw when the Space Shuttle Columbia entered the atmosphere that day. We saw flaming balls of molten steel and aluminum and other materials. Why? Because a few of these things had broken off the space shuttle, and they knew that they'd broken off. But in reality, they had no way of fixing it. They had no way to deal with it. So they just said, well, we'll just bring them in. We've lost tiles before. They'd never lost that many tiles. We've lost tiles before, we'll just bring it in. The engineers said, well, we shouldn't do that, and we should figure out something. They didn't figure out anything, they just brought them back, and of course they killed everyone on board, lost the space shuttle, and there you have it. And again, people say, well, that was probably more a political decision. NASA is a very political entity. The people that run NASA, they may be engineers, they may be astronauts, they may be whatever else, but they're first and foremost, they are politicians. And the decision was made by people that were not necessarily thinking ethically in terms of an engineer. Now, the other question that we could bring up here is, are 7 astronauts on a space shuttle, or 9 astronauts on a space shuttle, are they the general public? Do they count when we're talking about keeping paramount the safety of the public? Well, that's a good question that has to be asked. Are there situations where an engineer has to make a decision that may hurt or even kill people? And maybe those people are not considered the public at large. That maybe somebody might have to be sacrificed in order for the general public, most of the population, to be safe. Yes, there are situations like that. And there are plenty of those throughout history, decisions like that throughout history that had to be made, and people have died as a result. But you have to weigh, you have to kind of weigh those in the instant, at the time. Let's take a look at the Space Shuttle Challenger. That's another one that's famous for a disaster, right? This one has a much better documented history. Many of these, many engineering disasters, because they are political and because there's so much money involved, many of the disasters get covered up. There's often people that are trying to find what happened, and sometimes those people get labeled as conspiracy theorists or fear mongers because they're trying to make everybody afraid of bad engineering or afraid of technology or afraid of terrorism or something else. But quite often, those people are called fear mongers or conspiracy theorists by the people that are going to be in trouble if the truth is found out. And the Space Shuttle Challenger was one of those instances where somebody blew a whistle loud enough that they couldn't hide it. They tried to, but they couldn't. So what happened with the Space Shuttle Challenger? Well, let's go watch. So this is live footage in 1986 when I was in 6th grade. CNN was just new at the time.
T-minus 21 seconds, and the solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds.
Okay, so just in case you're not familiar with the space shuttle, what you're seeing here is the space shuttle, of course, and this big tank here is actually a fuel tank for the space shuttle itself. The space shuttle has 4 or 5, can't remember how many, I think 4, rocket boosters back here that are powered by hydrogen and oxygen. So essentially they just mix hydrogen and oxygen together and light a match. And it makes a huge propulsion system. But it requires a lot of space to store the fuel, and that's what this fuel tank does. It stores the fuel for the space shuttle. These 2 rockets on the side are solid rocket boosters made by a company called Thiokol in Utah, in northern Utah. And solid rocket boosters are essentially just big fireworks. They're a solid material that is flammable, and it is very carefully engineered so that the thrust from it all goes down, kind of like a bottle rocket, but very big bottle rockets, right? Most of the thrust comes from these 2 solid rocket boosters. That's where most of the thrust comes from. So, let's watch.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7,
What you're seeing down here is they're going to light a fire.
Engine start.
So light up the
4,
rocket.
3,
It's actually 3 of them, I guess.
1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Most of the smoke that you see coming out of those comes from the solid rocket boosters as well.
Engine's beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
So the 25th Space Shuttle mission is now on the way after more delays than NASA cares to count. This morning it looked as though they were not going to be able to get off.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance.
So that's what happened. These two streaks here are the solid rocket boosters. They're still intact. They went flying off in 2 directions. This right here is the space shuttle and the tank. This is that hydrogen-oxygen tank exploding and the space shuttle exploding with it. What happened? Let's take a look. Let's back it up a little bit. You can actually see what happened right here. So here's the space shuttle. Here's your solid rocket booster right up here. And if you pay attention right here, you're going to see something interesting happen.
Off.
Oops, missed it.
1 minute 50.
Get off after more delays than NASA cares to count. This morning it looked as though they were not going to be able to.
You see it happen? Right before the explosion. Right. See if I can find it.
Oh, you can see it there if you, with the preview.
Yeah, you can see it on the preview, but I want to get it up on the video so we can all see it. I need to pause it at just the right second, I guess.
We're not going to be able.
Right there. Here's your solid rocket booster. Here's your space shuttle. And there's a big flash right here, a big flare-up right here between the two. And what happened is that between the different parts of the solid rocket booster, the solid rocket booster comes disassembled to Florida, and then they build it, they put it together in Florida because it has to come by train all the way from Utah. In between the different parts, there are seals and gaskets that seal it all together to make sure that everything's working, right? It just so happens that one of those seals leaked. One of those seals failed in some way. And when one of those seals failed, it exposed that solid rocket fuel inside of there to air, to oxygen, and it was already piping hot because it had been running for a long time. It was almost completely extinguished. And so this fuel in there is really hot, ready to go, and they expose it to oxygen. It just ignited, and it exploded into the tank, the hydrogen and oxygen tank, and from there, hydrogen and oxygen, they'll explode in a quick hurry. And it exploded, blew up the space shuttle, and all you had left were the solid rocket boosters that weren't attached to anything anymore. Well, they assembled a group of scientists and engineers, the best scientists and engineers that they could find in the United States. And they called them all to Washington, D.C. to have a meeting, to form a committee to figure out what happened, what went wrong. All these scientists were experts in their fields. You know, several of them had Nobel Prizes in chemistry and physics and all kinds of things. They were just the top of the top, cream of the crop, connected to everybody. They know everybody. They all show up except one. One guy doesn't show up. The guy that doesn't show up is this guy. Probably the greatest scientist in American history. Richard Feynman. At age 18, this is probably the most famous picture of Richard Feynman, standing in front of a chalkboard here. At age 18, Richard Feynman he was in his second or third year at Princeton University. I think he went there at age 15 or 16. Princeton University being the best school for physics in the world. And he was studying theoretical physics, and they called him up. It was 1942 or 41, and they called him up. The federal government called him up and said, "We want you to go to New Mexico and help us build a bomb." He helped build the first nuclear bombs. At age 18, he was the youngest physicist, engineer on the project, on the Manhattan Project. Brilliant man. Didn't like the idea of building a bomb, but realized it was important to not lose the war, the Second World War. Well, they called him up to this committee, and he didn't show up. And they were kind of pissed, where's Richard? Why didn't he show up? He didn't show up. They had their meetings, they were talking about these things going on. They're in there in the big important building in Washington, D.C., reporting to the president every other day. Richard's not there. Finally, I think it was a week or two, and I think it was 2 weeks later, Richard Feynman shows up. And what does he show up with? He shows up with a rubber gasket. And they say, "Where have you been, Richard? We've been talking about this stuff, and we've been, deliberating and figuring out what went wrong." And he says, I know what went wrong. And they said, "How could you have possibly known what went wrong? You haven't been here." He said, "Well, because when they called me to this committee, I went to Utah. I actually went to Florida first. I went to Florida. And I talked to the people who put the rocket booster together. I talked to the engineers. And when I was done talking to them, I went to Utah. And I talked to the engineers that designed the dumb thing. And you know what I found out? I found out that they told you not to launch. They told NASA to not launch this space shuttle. They told them that they should never launch a space shuttle unless it's above 62 degrees. Because the gaskets that hold this space shuttles tight and hold all the fuel in and protect everything when they put it together will be ruined, will not work below those temperatures. And the temperature, the morning that they launched, was 29 degrees. You heard the CNN announcer say after many, many delays. Well, every time you delay a shuttle launch, it's the president that looks bad. 1986, Ronald Reagan was the president. And nobody wanted the president to look bad. It was his second term as president. They wanted him to look great, because they wanted to have another president follow him from their party. They ignored the engineers. They ignored hundreds of memos, hundreds of announcements from the engineers saying you should not launch this, you should only launch at certain temperatures, we should redesign this. They ignored it, they ignored it, they ignored it. Thiokol didn't want to admit that there was that big of a problem because they were making a ton of money. They still make a ton of money. Right? They launched anyway. And of course it broke. What Feynman did is he walked in with this little piece of rubber, this little rubber gasket. He walked in and he threw it he stuck it in a glass of ice water. And by the time they were done discussing what they wanted to discuss that day, he took it out and shattered it on the table. It just broke into pieces and he threw it down on the table. If he had not done that, probably to this very day, we would not have a straight answer of what happened. Because this is how governments and businesses always solve their problems. They never go to the engineer and say what went wrong. They always go to the politician or the guy running the thing. They always go to the boss. Or they form a committee of a bunch of people that are more worried about their image and more worried about their career than they are about the safety of the public. I assume you guys need to go because you have class. Go ahead. Have a good one. I'll continue recording these. So that's a classic example of people not listening to engineers, but what should have the engineers done? They should have sacrificed their jobs if they had to. They should have stood up and they should have gone to the news, and they never did. Well, it's happened in bigger situations as well. If you go into your book on page 71, they talk about the Space Shuttle Challenger. On page 74, they talk about the Missouri City television antenna. A huge collapse, right? A huge collapse of an antenna in the middle of a city. Page 76, they talk about one of the more deadly ones that happened. Hundreds of people died in 1978 when a walkway collapsed in a newly built hotel. The walkway was designed correctly, but it was built incorrectly. So the engineers designed it correctly, but they didn't go back and check to see if the builder actually built it according to their design. The builder built it completely differently, and it failed, killing a couple hundred people. On page 78, they talk about Hurricane Katrina. They address the topics of government corruption, contractor corruption, right? And people who sued, they sued the engineers, the environmentalists essentially, sued engineers for building levees that were going to kill off some turtle somewhere. And so they never got them built. They talk about all kinds of things that went wrong beyond that. Poor design, poor maintenance, poor preparation. They go on and on and on. And you could go online and you could search for unethical situations that have happened with engineers, and you'll come up with hundreds of them. Hundreds. And what it comes down to is that engineers are responsible for what happens with their designs, to a point. At some point, they can't be responsible for everything that everybody does. But they need to be responsible for the design, they need to be responsible for its implementation, and if it's not working out right, and if it's not meshing with those codes of ethics, they need to stand up and be a voice that is heard. Because oftentimes the people that are building the thing that they designed don't know. Oftentimes the politicians don't care. Oftentimes the businessman just wants to make money. The engineer knows everything technically about these things, about these designs, and they need to stand up. And it's an important responsibility. So we will be moving on to chapter 5 next time. And when we're done with chapter 5, we'll move on to our next project. Also, there's homework. The problems in the back of chapter 3, I want you to do problem 1. Type it up, email it to me. So chapter 3, problem 1 for tonight. And we'll see you guys on Monday.